Okay, thank you everybody for your patience. We'll get this meeting underway. Welcome to this forum put on by the Refugee Action Collective. I'm David Clans, chairing the forum tonight. I acknowledge, of course, that we are meeting tonight wherever we are on unceded Aboriginal land. Here at the library in Carlton, we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. The struggle for Aboriginal rights, the struggle for refugee rights are intimately linked. They're both struggles against racism and in particular racist government policies. So we pledge our solidarity. Now we have four excellent speakers for you tonight on the topic of deportations. And some of you might be thinking, why are we talking about deportations? Because on the 3rd of May, however you voted, and there's probably quite a wide variety of voting patterns in this room and online, but I'm sure everybody at this forum voted to reject the Trumpism of Dutton and the coalition. Trump said that, Dutton, Freudian slip. Dutton said that Trump had a brilliant big mind. Jacinta Price wore her MAGA cap and then suddenly realised that the overwhelming majority of people in Australia wanted nothing to do with Trumpism. And we've seen already since he took office in January some horrendous attacks, and in particular attacks on migrants and asylum seekers in the United States, people being dragged off the streets, really horrible stuff. And the sad thing is, on May the 3rd, when we thought we were voting against Trumpism, we were leaving intact a set of deportation laws that were passed by Labor with the support of the coalition right at the end of the 2024 parliamentary year, which have not yet led to people being snatched off the streets, but which put at risk up to 80,000 people of deportation. I won't go into the details. We've got speakers here who will cover that off. But there is actually a Trump-like threat to asylum seekers and refugees in this country. So what happens in America isn't just of passing interest. Now, I'll introduce the speakers as we go along, but we're actually going to start with a video. And the video is of an anti-deportation activist in Los Angeles. Her name is Clare Fester. She's a librarian, a union member, and active in anti-racist campaigning. And we have her as a video for no other reason that it's actually going on for 2 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles. This video is actually an extract of a longer presentation which she made at Easter, but I think nothing will have changed substantially, and it's still very useful. So we'll start with Clare, and then we will go on to hear from our three speakers here in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. We are in a very difficult situation in the US at the moment. The attacks are very intense. Our side is still in the process of cohering a resistance. We warned during the first Trump presidency that the fight to get rid of Trump wasn't just about those immediate 4 years. We knew that next time they would come back more organized, more competent, more vicious, and that's exactly what's happened. We also want that the Biden presidency wasn't a sigh of relief. It was a chance to prepare. And there are ways that the left could have used that time better that would put us in a stronger position today. Obviously, I can't go into detail about every attack and response because we'd be here for weeks. So I'm mostly going to talk about deportations, both the deportations of undocumented people and the detention and attempted deportation of Palestine activists, and share a little bit about the broader resistance that is coming together and specifically about the Labor fight back that we're seeing some glimmers of. So the deportations of undocumented people, I'm sure everyone's following it in the news, is extremely chilling. Every US president for a generation has had their own vicious deportation agenda, and no leftist will let anybody forget that Obama deported more people during his first term than Trump did. Obama had 1.1 million deportees. Trump only managed 800,000. Biden has also deported more in his term than compared with Trump's first time. It's actually not particularly possible to deport all the 11 million undocumented people, as Trump says that he wants to do. And there's a reason the Democrats and even more moderate Republicans haven't planned or enacted that in the past. The undocumented are a core part of the American economy. Agriculture, food service, domestic work, healthcare, childcare all completely rely on an undocumented underclass of workers. So Trump isn't really delivering on the mass deportation promise. And this is the part of the reason that he's pushing this self-deportation campaign to try and scare people into doing it themselves so that he can boost the numbers. And the current number is a little bit slippery, but the latest stats I could find is that month for month, Trump is deporting slower than Biden did in the same period. But the point was never to deport everybody. The point is to terrorize the community, broadcast the deportations loudly to appease Trump's most racist part of his base, and create a scapegoat for when all of his other policies fall apart, especially when we start feeling the tariffs and the massive social service cuts. And none of that is to say that we're just dealing with deportations as usual. What's different this time is the absolute campaign of fear and the total lack of due process. So I've lived in the US for coming up 10 years now. I live in California, which has the largest undocumented community in the country. They're about 6% of the population, and I have never seen people more afraid. People are scared to go to work, especially day laborers who wait in certain areas to be picked up to do cash in hand construction jobs, people who work in the fields, anywhere where there's a concentration of undocumented workers. It's very easy for ICE to come down on them. And if you want a general sense of the climate, look at the White House or ICE official Instagram accounts. It is like extremely unhinged stuff. I have to double take every day to check it's not a satire magazine every time they post. People don't want to drop their kids at school. ICE can go into schools and hospitals and churches now, which used to be prohibited. They were sensitive areas. Just last week, ICE tried to go into 2 schools in South LA, which is a historically Black neighborhood, but now very Latino. They fully lied. They said this to the school front office people that they had parental permission, as if that would ever happen. But thankfully, the union was prepared and the school turned them away. The teachers union in the LA district, which is the second biggest district in the country, is really strong against deportations. They have a history of resolutions about it. They're also looking at contract language to protect undocumented students. Their victorious strike back in 2019 had like undocumented families and anti-racism at the front and center. And it's been that long preparation is why the schools are relatively safe now. Broadly, there's a growing movement for immigrant rights. There's a concerted Know Your Rights campaign that in some instances has delayed and potentially even prevented deportations. So under the 4th and 5th Amendments to the Constitution, there are these provisions like you have a right to a lawyer, the ICE needs a signed warrant by a certain kind of judge. For you to open the door, you're not required to let them in, you're not required to talk to them. And there are these little cards that give you a script when ICE shows up. And the printers who make those cards cannot keep up with the demand. Many of us carry them around. I carry them in my pockets when I'm at work. In all the languages that the people in my community speak. Right now, the movement is working really hard towards May Day, which is historically a very important day, not just for the obvious reasons, but because there were mass demos and a strike of immigrants in the 2000s that helped win DACA, which was Obama's temporary protection of undocumented children if they were brought here as children. And it's going to be a really good chance to show that immigrants are not just a besieged community, they're also an extremely powerful part of the working class. There are lots of political issues inside the movement. It's very much Chicano, like Mexican-American led, which of course makes sense. They're such a target. The self-organization of the community is really impressive. Our comrades in Marx 21 are generally pretty looped into what's happening in immigrant rights, but none of us knew about the initial marches because they were built in specific Chicano community institutions. And that strategy comes at a cost. There are actually much larger layers of people who could be mobilized against deportations, but there's not currently an orientation towards them. And I disagree with that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, non-immigrants have a responsibility to show up right now, and we're obviously doing that, even though we're on the periphery of the organizing. And that's not just for moral reasons, but because the more the fear campaign goes on, the more people start to accept and believe it. And racist ideas about immigrants are poison to the working class, and they'll have us dobbing each other into ICE rather than uniting against our common enemy. Mm. Knowing our rights is also not enough. Rights don't exist in the abstract, like written down in the Constitution. Whether we have rights depends on the objective political conditions that we're living in. The Republicans have the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. So you can send ICE away because they don't have a warrant today, but they can just go and get a warrant and come back tomorrow. And people can scream their rights in the street, and ICE will pick them up in plain clothes in unmarked vehicles, regardless. In fact, one person did this last week, and ICE just smashed their car window and took them away anyway while they were on the phone to the lawyer. And that person is a unionized farm worker, and his union has marched to the detention center and they're organizing around that. ICE is reportedly going to be monitoring social media, not just of tourists or immigrants, but domestically too, to see if they're posting content that is unfavorable to Trump and ICE's goals. So we need to start talking not just about knowing our rights, but defending our rights, taking our rights back. Palestine deportations. We're not only facing the undocumented ones, but the attacks on the Palestine activists, student activists. It's very naked what they're trying to do. It's on purpose that they went after someone at Columbia first, Mahmoud Khalil, because Columbia kicked off the encampment movement last year. And they're using Columbia as an example to pull everyone else in line, not just about Palestine, but about every social justice cause. And one of the things the government has demanded in exchange for Columbia getting their federal funds back is total control of like the ethnic studies type departments. And that's been on the table for a while, but now they basically want total control over the university, including things like hiring, curriculum. And it's a terrible strategy from Columbia to roll over like they did. It won't work to give in now. It's not going to protect anyone from future funding freezes. And it's weird to be on the side of an elite university, but thankfully Harvard has pushed back and isn't following Columbia's example. But the attacks on the individual universities and the attempted deportations aren't about removing all funding or deporting all activists. It's about making people so afraid that they won't fight anymore. The unions will stop taking political stands, the student groups will get shut down, and so on. Universities have already preemptively banned Students for Palestine groups in a lot of places as a way to show, like, we want to keep our federal funds. It's also a big distraction in a lot of ways. Like, obviously, of course, we have to be organizing around the people who've been detained, but it means that we're not organizing around the genocide that is still happening. People have to use their energy to scramble about this instead of mobilizing for Gaza. And it's intentional that Trump is going after the universities. They're some of the better unionized workplaces in the country, for one. And they're also one of the last places where you can have free discussion about ideas and politics. Not that they're exactly free right now, but Trump wants to destroy, what we have remaining of that. I'm starting to feel afraid myself. I'm a naturalized American citizen. I have an American passport. I'm white. I'm from a country that's very friendly to American capitalism. I'm cis. I don't study or work at a university, and I'm obviously not the highest person on the list. But I know I'm at risk because it wouldn't be the first time that the US revoked naturalized citizenship for political reasons. This is what they did to the Japanese during the Second World War. They rounded them up and they put them in camps. And I also know I'm at risk because Trump has said outright that they're coming for citizens next. This week, there was a report of ICE picking up a citizen and detaining them despite his mum presenting his American birth certificate. So every non-native born person I know is making a contingency plan at the moment. But we are not fleeing yet. There is still a lot of work to do. So I said a bit about immigrant rights movement, but more broadly, there are kind of two types of resistance cohering at the moment: institutional resistance and popular resistance. And there's obviously a relationship between the two. But there was already historic low trust in government institutions before Trump was reelected, especially because he stacked the Supreme Court during the first presidency. And now their hollowness is really on full display. Like federal judge after federal judge keep ruling against various actions. They ruled that Trump had to bring back the immigrant who was wrongly sent to the notorious torture camp in El Salvador. But both Trump and the Salvadoran President Bukele just were like, nah, we're not following that order. Mahmoud Khalil has a ruling in his case that his case needs to proceed in New Jersey. Weeks ago, that was ruled, and he's still languishing in a Louisiana detention center. So the idea that there are any like checks and balances in American democracy is cracking apart for a lot of people. And Trump is building, a much more authoritarian, racist version of capitalist democracy with the political power being concentrated in his hands in the executive. And although Trump flirts with fascism, has fascistic ideas, it's important to say that the US hasn't fully crumbled into fascism. The majority of the ruling class is still aligned with the old liberal world order, both in terms of foreign policy and domestically. This is apparent, like in the opposition to what Trump's been doing around Ukraine, the reactions to the tariffs, and so on. So we haven't seen capital relinquish itself to fascism at this point. And that's an important distinction, not for like quibbling about definitions or trying to say, oh, it's not that bad. It matters because we can still fight in the open. Some people who think that this is fascism have either just given up entirely or are starting to move things underground. And things may get worse. People may need to go underground at some point, but we're not there. And while there are possibilities to fight in the open and be building popular mass movements, we have to take them.
As Con said earlier, some of what is happening around the world is actually coming from the Australian experience. And the real danger is Australian governments will learn from the overseas experience. So that gives us a sense of how bad things can be, but it's important we also focus on how we can resist. So our second speaker is Ellen Roberts, and thank you, Ellen, for joining us from Queensland this evening. Ellen was involved nine and a half years ago now in what was one of the most successful anti-deportation campaigns in modern Australian history. Con mentioned the case of the Biloela family. That's quite well known, but what is less known, but needs to be remembered, is the campaign to save Baby Asha. And we will pass over to Ellen, and who has some slides to share with you.
Thanks so much, David. I'd also like to acknowledge the true owners of the land, the Aboriginal people. I'm in the land of the Yaga and the Turrbal people. And I was at a conference about Palestine on the weekend, and there was a great acknowledgement there, which said that, part of acknowledging is acknowledging the injustice that this country is built on and recommitting ourselves to the fight for First Nations justice. I'd also just like to, so I'm going to talk a bit about like a very successful campaign moment where like people flooded in and it was extremely popular and there was a lot of media about it. But I guess I just also want to acknowledge some of the people in this room who have been part of the fight for refugee rights for so long. Like people like David, for example, or Ian Rintoul. I was looking at some 10-year-old photos. Mark Gillespie here in Brisbane, and Con, who I first met nearly 25 years ago when he was at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. And I think that it's very important that we focus on these kind of high points like I'm going to talk about tonight, but I think true solidarity is committing over many, many decades to the struggle. So I just want to acknowledge some of the people in this room and their important work on refugee rights. I might just, is that my slides showing or shall I? Okay, great. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we can learn from the Lady Cilento Vigil. If you want to go on to the next slide, number 2, David.
Yep, we're there.
So what was it? It was in February 2016. And for 11 days, a combination of unionists and community members maintained a presence outside the Lady Cilento Hospital, which is now the Brisbane Children's Hospital, to prevent the deportation of Baby Asha, which is a pseudonym. And Baby Asha was an 18-month-old from Nepal who had suffered burns on Nauru and was in the Brisbane Children's Hospital, as it is now, for medical treatment. My involvement was I was at home on a Friday night. I'd had a few beers and got a call that there was a baby at risk of deportation in the children's hospital, and went down and slept the first night on the hard concrete. But then I was working for Get Up and became one of the key organisers, working with the Queensland Council of Unions and the Refugee Action Collective in Queensland to bring together people over those 11 days. And we were successful at the end in making sure that Baby Asha was released into the community. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is why that was successful. If you want to go on to the next slide.
Yeah.
I'm also happy to take questions, David, during it. In fact, I've got a question slide halfway through, if that's not too awkward to facilitate.
No, we'll try and do that. We're on slide 3 at the moment.
Great. So the campaign to stop the deportation of Baby Asha was, I think, number one, is probably the most important. It was part of a bigger campaign called Let Them Stay. I assume that many of you, or some of you at least in the room, were part of Let Them Stay, the Let Them Stay campaign. In terms of what unfolded on the ground, it was very much a collaborative effort. I've talked about the role of the Queensland Council of Unions and also Refugee Action Collective, amongst others, but there was a very close collaborative effort. And then finally, I just want to talk about how it used a diversity of tactics, the visual did, but centred direct action. So I'll just go over these 3 points. That it was part of a big campaign, was a collaborative effort on the ground. I think particularly the role of unions were important, and used a diversity of tactics, but centred direct action. So the Let Them Stay campaign, it aimed to prevent the deportation of 267 asylum seekers, many children born in Australia, to prevent them to being deported back to Nauru. So many people had arrived in Australia for medical treatment. And this was not a new phenomenon, that people would be brought from offshore detention, particularly to Brisbane as kind of like the northernmost capital, but then they would so often be deported back. So this was not a new situation that unfolded, but what was new was some of the legal action that was taken against those deportations and the kind of big community campaign around it. So Let Them Stay used court actions, high-profile media stories, mass rallies, workplace actions, and direct action trainings to really highlight the issue there. And you can see, I think, what was particularly crucial in the Let Them Stay campaign was the babies. People might remember the front pages of the Fairfax papers as they were then, featuring some of these babies that were going to be born, they were born in Australia but were facing deportation back to Nauru. And that was really a kind of a point of connection for many Australian people. And I think, you know, so often in the refugee rights movement, we're hamstrung by the fact that the whole system for asylum seekers is punitive, and that if people speak out about their individual situation, that they may face problems being accepted as refugees, for example, and they consider that they've created an unnecessary risk for themselves in Australia. And so I think, like, profiling the images of the babies that were at risk, as I said, was an important way of communicating with the Australian community, but also like getting around some of the complexities of representing the situation for adults. You can see all, you probably may not be able to see very well, but this is a whole bunch of rallies happening in February 2016. RAC Sydney, RAC Victoria, Canberra, Refugee Action, Hunter, Refugee Action Network in WA, RAC Queensland. So clearly RAC was really at the heart of a lot of this Let Them Stay organising. So I just wanted, if there are people in the room who were a part of the Let Them Stay campaign now nearly 10 years ago, I'm just wondering whether people have reflections. I certainly do, and we'll come to that on my next slide about why it was successful.
Would people like to share some of their reflections?
Just one piece of feedback that people may not be aware of was not about me, but I was actually doing some work at MITRE at the time, doing some IT tutoring for them, which I got in through some angles that we don't need to go into. But I actually went in on the day after the court ruling, and the place was in lockdown, and they literally were preparing and getting it set up for people to be sent back. Because there was a bit of commentary around the time of, oh, the government's won the case, but they're not going to send them back. And I can tell you for sure that, you know, having literally been inside there and There were no classes happening that day. Nobody was being allowed out from their sections. The place was in lockdown, in absolute preparation for people to start being sent back. And that was when those rallies happened, and they were I suspect, in my recollection, I think they were some of the biggest rallies that had happened over the last 10 years or more that I've been involved. And I think it was that mass action that really put a pause into what the government of the day had planned, had systems in place, and was getting ready to do. So it's sort of a bit of old history now, but if anyone, and I did have conversations with people who were saying, oh, they won the catch, but they wouldn't dare do it. They absolutely were prepared to do it, and they absolutely were ready and set up to do it. And if it wasn't mass action, it absolutely would have happened.
Anybody? I can't see people online, but anybody else in the room who's got a reflection from those days? If not, we'll pass back to Ellen.
I think that's a really good point about the court case. And, I guess the way that court cases, they're kind of like sort of winner takes all in some ways, but I do think the Let Them Stay campaign was successful at mobilising a court win into transforming a court loss, into a real moment for community mobilisation, that people weren't dispirited by the court, by the court loss, but were instead much more motivated about it. And there was sort of a huge amount of media coverage. I guess a number of things that I think were very important for the Let Them Stay campaign, and I've alluded to one already in terms of the babies that were photographed, babies and toddlers that were very central to the kind of campaign imagery, was that it was very clear, it was very tangible, and it was very people-centered. It wasn't about the abstract notions in the Refugees Convention or various policy mechanisms. It was very much about these specific individuals and representing them and what they were going to suffer. So I think that was very effective. It involved a lot of organisations. I've mentioned Refugee Action Collective, Asylum Seeker Resource Centre was involved, but Get Up and the Australian Refugees Church Refugee Task Force, I'm getting the name incorrect slightly, and the Human Rights Law Centre was sort of really core at driving strategy. And I think we can see this with broad sort of movements that can be like a coalition, but have a sort of smaller nucleus of organisations that are very able to respond to situations as they're unfolding. And you can see two women there. That's Shen Narayanasamy on the right and Misha Coleman from the Church Refugee Task Force on the left. And I think if you ever have a chance to see Shen Narayanasamy speak, she's in Melbourne. I would say, I've been in the environment movement for a long time, and I still confidently say I think she's the most talented campaigner in this country. And she really drove a lot of the Let Them Stay let them stay strategy, and I think it was just extremely hardworking during that whole period. But that picture of Misha and Shen is also at a training that was held at a church. And really, I think what was another thing that was so effective about the Let Them Stay campaign was the role of the churches, and specifically the notion of sanctuary. And we heard from a US speaker previously, and I think this idea is more developed in the US, but that there are places where people are at risk of deportation where they can go and be given sanctuary. And you can see here on the previous slide, if you want to go back one, David, to slide 6, you can see there just a Lutheran church in outer suburban Brisbane saying, "We stand for sanctuary." And so these suburban churches across Australia were declaring themselves sites of sanctuary. So it's very decentralized, but it was very meaningful for the people involved in those communities. It came with a lot of moral power. And so broadly, the Let Them Stay campaign, we talked previously about court cases, about all the media work, but it really centered direct action and the idea that people would be putting their own bodies on the line to be stopping people from being deported. The obvious thing that I'm sure you're going to be thinking is, because we have mandatory detention in Australia, most people are deported from immigration detention. You don't necessarily have the opportunity to provide people sanctuary in a place like a church. But I think just the involvement of churches, some of the Let Them Stay rallies, particularly here in Brisbane, were on the steps of the St Anne's Cathedral. So people weren't necessarily going all the way out to the detention centre, but they were flocking to those places of sanctuary in order to provide support for the churches and others that were offering themselves up to do that. Because obviously many of these asylum seekers were in the community at that point. So I'll just go back to the Baby Asha. So it was very much a collaborative effort on the ground. It's not the best photo there, particularly of me, but I just wanted to feature the woman on the right there, who is Ros McClellan, who was the secretary of the Queensland Council of Unions. And the QCU were just absolutely vital in providing so much infrastructure. That, it's February in Brisbane. It's like camping outside on hot concrete for days and days and days, and they provided marquees and water, but also turnout of their members. So we had CFMEU members, people walking off the job. All of these workplaces were encouraged to come down. They bought union flags, they organised rallies. Like, just the role of the unionists was really, really crucial. And then Get Up, we turned our members out, and Shen from Get Up was kind of like running the sort of supportive comms strategy. And then Queensland Refugee Action Collective, we all collaborated on the infrastructure for the vigil. And then once those kind of large pieces were in place, people just poured into that space because they sensed the meaningfulness of what they were doing. And so schools were bringing busloads of kids down. People were just like dropping off cakes and all sorts of food. A sort of peak of the activity was every afternoon we would just stand on the side of the busy road where the hospital was, and just so many people driving by and honking in support. And then it all kind of coalesced. I'm not sure whether I changed the slide in time that people can see that slide of Con and I. But essentially the vigil sort of culminated basically on the pretty much close to the end. It was Saturday night. It actually happened to be my 40th birthday. It was Saturday night. I was down the road having a beer with Con, and then there was word happened that they were going to be deporting Baby Asha from the hospital. And so everyone just, whatever their involvement at the vigil had been, came to that place, and the hospital entrances were blocked to prevent anyone from leaving. So it was a really big night, but it was like Ros McClellan, who I showed you the photo of before, the secretary of the Queensland Council of Unions, was checking cars as they went through. The union officials themselves were very involved in making sure that that Baby Asha wasn't deported. And so it was a real show of strength. I guess I do want to just say something briefly about the political context in which this was all happening. So Malcolm Turnbull was PM and Dutton was Immigration Minister. And so, but politically, and I think this is partly Shen's genius, Dan Andrews was the first Labor Premier, and then Palaszczuk they had made supportive statements as premiers, as Labor premiers, that they, were opposed to the deportation of the people that were the subject of the Let Them Stay campaign. And so it was extremely hands-off from the police. I've never experienced anything like that. This is like hundreds of people blockading a hospital in the middle of Brisbane, and there was probably 4 or 5 police officers there. So I think that's when you have a kind of like level of political consensus that came because of the fact that it was a huge national movement, then that really changed the way that the protest itself was policed. So yes, a really big and important moment, but I do think like some of those elements around thinking about when and how what you're communicating, enabling a collaboration to function, and that might mean having smaller groups making decision-making, but trying to bring as many people in as possible, giving people decentralized actions to do, whether that's workplace, but then also I think this role of like, I'm putting my body on the line, I'm taking a risk, and centering direct action, I think was really crucial. That's me.
Thank you, Ellen. That was great. If there are questions, we'll take them quickly now. And if you think of questions later, there will be a little bit of time at the end. But if there's any immediate questions or comments, happy to take them. If you're online, put your electronic hand up. Peter.
Thanks, Helen. Listening to you, I was reminded of, we often tell each other when we are out in the street or in demos or taking action as refugee activists, that we do what we can. And it's so important, and you very well explained that It's not one thing or two things or three things or five things that we do that makes a difference. It's all the things that we do.
John, this person here put their hand up first.
Hi, I wanted to know, well, what, after the Let Them Stay campaign, what happened to all those people? Like, what stopped the government from deporting them a year later when public opinion had changed or was no longer there? I'm not Australian, so I don't know what happened, but.
No, it's a good question, regardless of where you're from. So maybe Ellen, if you would like to answer that question, and then we'll move along.
Well, I mean, Con actually may know the answer to this as well. I mean, my understanding is that they have remained in Australia, but not necessarily receiving permanent protection, and some of them remaining in a state of limbo for what is now like up to 10 years. So yes, I mean, it certainly wasn't like it was very much a kind of temporary reprieve. So yeah, I mean, yes, Con may know some more about particular individuals who are the subject of that. But like, yeah. And
Yeah. And Ellen's right. There's still 8,500 people that are part of that cohort that remain on temporary visas in limbo. I'm happy to touch on that in more detail a little bit later, but the critical thing was it's an amazing example of effective advocacy and activism. Ellen's been doing it for more than 20 years, is incredible at it, both the refugee and environmental space.
Well, thank you, Ellen.
thanks, Con.
What I want you sharing tonight, which is hope, that
Of course.
our victories, and we do win. I think it's so important what you're sharing tonight. Like, there isn't hopeless. We can win. We do have the power to stop government.
Absolutely. Look, I'm going to move on, and we'll have some questions before we finish up. We were going to be joined next by Joey Tangalo Toali, who has been in MITA now for 5 years, I think. He was born in Tonga. He can't join us because he messaged me to say that his laptop has been sent to Tonga in preparation for his deportation, and he was having trouble getting online on Zoom on his phone. So I will just remind you on his behalf that this is an example of the Australian system in operation, and I have to say this is the system before December's law change. Joey is somebody who was born in Tonga, came here as a small child, lived his entire life up until now in Australia, has, I think, something like a dozen children, or a substantial number of children, and maybe a dozen grandchildren. I can't remember the exact figures, but he has a big family here in Australia. He has a daughter buried in Faulkner Cemetery. His life is here, in the bad parts, and he would fess up to that, but also the good parts. But because he's not a citizen, because his parents never dealt with that paperwork and he never thought it was important, when he was sent to jail, that automatically triggered a deportation notice under Section 501 of the Migration Act. So he spent 8 years in jail, and he has no complaint about that. It's classic, do the crime, do the time. But if he'd been a citizen, he would now be playing with his grandchildren. Because he's not a citizen, he's been in MITA, as I say, I've lost track now, for something like 5 years. And he has spoken multiple times at our meetings. A month ago, he said he was being deported, and I contacted him on what I thought was his last night in Australia. His possessions had, by and large, been packed up and sent to Tonga. And here we are a month, 6 weeks later. He's still in MITA. He has no idea when he's going to leave. It's, you know, we often talk about refugees and asylum seekers being in limbo, but this is literally in limbo. He doesn't want to go to Tonga. I'm sure he doesn't want to stay in MITA. The option he really wants, which is to go home to his family, is taken from him. So I'm afraid he's not here to tell you himself, but that's just a little bit of a snapshot. Before we go on to our final speaker of the night, who's already spoken several times, and thank you, Con, for helping us out during our technical glitches, and I apologise to everybody about those technical glitches. Our final speaker, I should formally introduce him, is Karapanagiotidis, who is the CEO of the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre. You've already heard him speak, but now this is an opportunity for you to give us the full breadth of what you had in mind.
Thank you. Well, good evening again, everyone. Start by acknowledging that we're gathering on the land of the Wurundjeri people. The Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders, both past and present. I encourage people, there is a walk for truth happening at the moment, organised by the Uruk Justice Commission. If you Google Walk for Truth, and Travis Lovett, the Deputy Commissioner, is doing a 430k walk through Victoria to hand down what will be the First Nations-led inquiry into historical and ongoing injustices to First Nations people. And on the 16th of June, there'll be a walk happening from Footscray, and on the 17th of June, there'll be one from the Shrine of Remembrance to Parliament House. So if you go online and have a look, it's a great opportunity. I'll be walking on the 16th and possibly the 17th as well. So just encouraging people. And at times like now, it's so important to show up, especially after what happened with the referendum. What I thought I could talk about are these three laws, what they could mean for people seeking asylum, refugees and immigrants, why they happen, but what we can do. I want to finish on the optimistic note of what we can do if the government tries using them, and the ways that we can do a lot of what Ellen shared in her learnings from the Baby Asha campaign around those things hold till today. So very quickly, first of all, Australia is unique in leading the way in the world for the worst, most brutal and draconian immigration policies in the world. We have gone far beyond what even Donald Trump has tried so far, and beyond what the UK has done. And every one of those things you see at the moment, sending people into offshore detention centres, trying to remove people without due process. At the heart of this, they've learned all of this from Australia. We are its pioneers. We are unique in being the only industrialised country in the world with a policy of the indefinite detention of anyone who arrives undocumented for an indefinite period of time, including children. In the United States and through Europe, there are strict time limits on how long you can detain children for, typically between 3, 6, 7 to maybe 14 days. While in Australia, we detain children on Nauru for upwards of 6 years. While there are currently no children in detention, thousands have been detained over the last couple of decades. Now, this policy is bipartisan. Remember, it's the Ds: demonisation, dehumanisation, forcing people into destitution, and then deportation. And at the heart of all of this has been a race to the bottom that began from the days of John Howard, made possible by Paul Keating when he introduced mandatory detention in 1992. But at the very heart of it, since the days of Howard and the arrival of the Tampa, we will decide who comes to this country in the manner in which they came, which is in response to 436 refugees that have been rescued at sea by a Norwegian sea captain. And we never recovered from that. September 11th happened. And what we saw was what was a humanitarian and moral issue being conflated into an issue about safety, borders, protection. Refugees, people fleeing terrorism, being conflated with terrorists. And the idea being that we need to be safe. Over the last 25 years, Labor and the Liberal Party have together supported every single inhumane policy. This is all bipartisan. The reopening 2 times of offshore detention centres in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, the idea of taking people who arrive by sea, something protected under the Refugee Convention, that is, there's no such thing as an illegal person seeking asylum, there's no such thing as a queue, and there's no such thing as a right or wrong way. And this is why no one is ever criminally charged with an offence, because no offence has ever been committed. So you're allowed to come by sea, which is often the only way people are able to come to this country from some of the most dangerous countries on earth, because Australia refuses to provide safe passage. Our refugee intake doesn't even fit in the top 60 based on GDP anywhere in the world. But at the heart of this, recently, we saw us go even more sharply to the right. And what triggered that? Obviously, an election, and we've had, it was kind of heartening on the one hand to see the last election. There's a sliver of hope where people did reject the politics of extremism and reject the politics of fear. And while there were many reasons people voted, one of it was multicultural communities rejecting that, women rejecting that, young people rejecting that. In fact, we had done polling 2 months before the election, met with a coalition, met with Labor, who always said to us, if you can shift public sentiment as a movement, we'll follow you. So we sat there and said, 75% of Australians do not support indefinite detention, do not support offshore detention, want a universal safety net for people. These politics aren't working anymore. And we tried to explain to the coalition, we did not want to hear about it at all. One of the big trigger points were, many of you remember the High Court about a year ago releasing 250 people from detention centres. The reason they had done that was the High Court going, detention is for the purpose of processing, that is, you've got a live case on foot, hey, are you a refugee? Or for the purpose of removal. But it's got to be for one or the other. That is, you can't keep people in detention that have already been found to be refugees and keep them there forever. And so the High Court ruled this is unconstitutional. And about 250 people were released. Now, a small minority of them had committed awful crimes, murder, rape, had done awful things, but they had served their time once and often twice over. That is, when you commit an offence like that, you're put into immigration detention. If you're convicted, you're then put into a prison system. Upon serving your time, you're not released. You're put back into a detention centre. And most of these men had served years on top of that sentence. But many others had committed no criminal offence. And there were many others on top of that who were just stateless, and others who had committed offences that for most Australians would have been a community-based order, would have been a diversion, would have been a fine or a bond. But the threshold is so low. In fact, people seeking asylum are forced to sign a code of conduct, that exists till today. And just to understand, now, whilst it is rarely executed at such a threshold, in this code of conduct, it allows the government to cancel your visa for things like being an annoyance at work, gossiping at work, passing a stop sign, passing a red light, causing disruption to your neighbours, to say having a house party. It's called a code of conduct. It is real. And that's as low as the threshold is. So the idea is detention is used, like Ellen was talking about, and as you heard our first pre-recorded speaker, detention is used for the following. Historically, because they see boats in them. They know it's immoral. They know it's inhumane. They know it's not saving lives. If they cared about saving lives, they would care about the countless number of people that have taken their lives recently in the community after 12 years of limbo, and have sheer desperation. A poor young man yet again in the last fortnight. They would care about all the people that drown at sea because they refuse to provide safe passage. None of this is about saving lives. None of this is about safety or dignity. It is all about winning elections on the idea that we're being invaded. And then using language like on water operational matters, stop the boat, Operation Sovereign Borders. So these men get released, and these men have served their time. And it's like the sky's fallen in. And everywhere, rapists, murderers, they're on the streets. We're all apparently in danger. 60,000 Australians a year get released from custodial settings. 60,000. Because we believe you serve the time, you do the time. We believe in rehabilitation. We believe in one law for one people, and that everyone should be equal before the law. And people should be given a second chance. We're not North Korea. We don't lock people up forever. At the time, we speak with Labor and go, let us work with you on this. We don't want any money from you. We don't take any federal funding, but you could fund some other refugee charities, and let us work together. When we helped evacuate hundreds of men from Papua New Guinea, Nauru under Medivac, none of these men offended. Because you know what we did? We funded all these charities. The ACC funded all these charities, partnered, provided every man $1,000 to be able to have some basic dignity, linked them in with other charities, helped with bonds, first couple of months of rent. The whole community, amazing refugee advocates across Australia and charities work together. And surprise, surprise, if you give people stability, dignity, and safety, the last thing these people want to do is be locked up again. So what happened? You started hearing reports of men reoffending. And what was most of that? That was things like one man stealing clothes at an airport out of desperation, people stealing food. Most of these were low-level things out of sheer desperation, because what did they do? They put these men in remote hotels in the middle of nowhere with a couple of $100, $317 to be exact, and said to them, okay, you've got a couple of weeks to go and find yourself work. And then what did they start doing? They started chipping them with ankle bracelets and curfews. And it just blew up in their face. And at the time, they're like, well, we had to neutralize Peter Dutton. And I go, all you've done is empower and embolden him to the idea that these people are subhuman and these people are the constant threat. And this is all, at the heart of it is deep racism, the idea of these refugees who are subhuman and are a constant threat to our community. Within all of this, the government opening up that door, failing to show courage and leadership, seeing an election on the horizon, rams through 3 bills. And I remember sitting there with the coalition at the time going, why would you support this? It's your bread and butter trying to, what had worked in the past, sitting there trying to use kind of reverse psychology and go, you're the party of anti-immigration. You're the party that's hard-line this. Why would you let them cut your lunch? Why would you give them this free pass? And they said to me, we would never, ever in power be able to pass these laws ourselves. And it's just an offer too good to refuse. And each of these 3 laws I'm about to explain, we had defeated each of them individually. Each of them. And in fact, in most of them, Labor had voted against these when in opposition. So what were the 3 laws? So these 3 laws were passed. There was no crisis. There was no need. This was completely fabricated. And it goes beyond anything you've seen Trump do. The 3 laws allowed the following. 1 was for people in detention. Used to be called the Prohibiting Items of Detention Bill. We won't worry about the names. But it's one that allows you to take the phones away from people, the laptops, like you just heard there, away from people, without a warrant. Without a warrant to check or search. It allows dogs to be used. It allows anyone that immigration designates as a person. So it could literally be me or David, just designated as a person allowed to strip search someone. And at the heart of it is about out of sight, out of mind. They saw what people like Beirut and Moz and many others did with a phone and said, what we need to do is make sure these people have no way to communicate. What does a phone allow you to do? Tell people what's going on in detention, allow you to access lawyers quickly, help you stop your deportation. That got passed. The same one that 151,000 Australians signed a petition. You and Jackie Lambie circulated that, saying we oppose it, Labor opposed it at the time, and we stopped it at the time. And what did they use again? Oh, there's child porn and all sorts of inappropriate things on these phones. And we had to kind of point to, at the time when Labor helped us block it in opposition, going, you do know under immigration law, anything of that nature can be confiscated immediately. Anything of that nature is unlawful, and they already have those powers. Again, those powers already exist. It was simply for the purpose of going, if we can confiscate the ways that people can communicate, we can cut them off from advocacy, from help, from humanizing them and hiding what's happening in detention. That's the agenda there. Because they have laws to protect against all other things already in place. Law 1. Law 2, you think about Trump's Muslim ban. Well, we now have a law that if the Australian government at any time can designate a country of removal concern. So let's say, I'm a Greek Australian, let's say they go, Greece is not taking people back that are found, this applies to migrants, refugees, people seeking asylum, all non-citizens. Oh, Greece isn't taking back failed migrants at the moment. We're going to ban everyone from Greece from entering Australia for any purpose. Funeral, wedding, study, business, work, you're all banned. It is now law in this country that Australia can designate any country in the world, and ban that country from having any of its citizens enter here until it agrees to take people back against their will. That's law number 2. It gets worse. The third one is, so they're sitting there going, damn this high court, and this is Labor going, democracy, constitution, transparency, rule of law. How do we get around the high court? So they passed a third law which says we can in fact detain people while they have a legal case still on foot. That includes before the courts. That is a valid case before the courts appealing an earlier decision, and we can remove them. And if that person refuses to participate in the removal, they will face a mandatory 1 to 5 year jail term. That is now law in Australia. These are laws in Australia, the greatest attack on multiculturalism since the White Australia policy. So unless you agree to self-deport yourself, you're hearing about what Trump's doing, where did you get that from? Unless you agree to self-deport yourself, you will be jailed, even when you got a court case on foot. if the government decides that you should leave and you should be removed. So the ability to confiscate all forms of communication, the ability to designate and ban any country, the ability to jail people for exercising their legal right, this is completely unconstitutional. We're just waiting for that first attempt to use that law in that situation. And the last part, the ability to designate any country in the world as an offshore detention facility for the purpose of processing people. So what they'll say is, oh, David is in detention that we don't want to let out. Oh, that High Court's going to force us to. Oh, we're going to send them to South Sudan. We're going to send them to North Korea. We're going to send them. You could send them anywhere under this law, pay that country, and that country will be a legitimate processing place without any lawful requirement to assess whether it's in breach of our legal obligations under the Geneva Convention, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the ICC. No requirements for any sort of human rights guarantees that that person will not be tortured, killed, or deported back to the country of origin. These are now all laws in Australia. Yeah? Now, so they did all of that going, oh, we're now going to have this great story. So what did we do as an organization? They thought they were going to have this great tough on crime story. A lot of what Ellen was just talking about, we came out and said, this is an attack on multiculturalism. This is an attack on the contribution of immigrants. This is trying to create a two-tier legal system that is actually about saying that people shouldn't be treated equally before the law, but will be treated differently according to where they were born and the color of their skin. And that this is an attack on our legal system, on our constitution, on our rule of law, and the idea that everyone is equal before the law. And they lost all the narrative. What they thought they were going to get from it, they lost. So from ABC to SBS to The Guardian to mainstream news, we're all talking about, oh my God, they've been given godlike powers that are discriminatory, that are unconstitutional, and that resemble the White Australia policy. They received a massive backlash to that, and it's the reason they haven't used those laws yet. They haven't used them yet, but they haven't repealed them, they haven't committed to repealing them, and they're not going to. So the last part of this, so where do we come in? There are at the moment 8,500 people that have been here for more than 12 years seeking asylum under this system created by both Labor and Liberal, that because they came by boat, lawful under the Refugee Convention, they are people that are technically people that are at the mercy of the government. That is, the government now decides whether or not to lift the bar and allow them to be considered for a permanent visa. These people are from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, South Sudan, Venezuela, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Many of these came as children who are now adults, and they want to send them back. We have been working along with our sector to try to get the government to let all these people stay, to ask for a commitment, to lift the bar and allow them all to be properly assessed. Because the same government scrapped the system that had failed these people in the first place. So where do we come in? We are trying to find a balance here at the moment. We're having a dialogue. We're working closely with refugees, and one of the critical things that makes the campaign so powerful have been the voices of refugees. Refugees come with all delegations the ACC does to Canberra. They did 100 days of incredible protests in front of Home Affairs officers and Tony Burke's officers. They cut through and lead like no one else. And working together with refugee communities, we are now preparing for the fact that if the government does not let these people stay, well, then we're going to have to start building sanctuaries and working with unions, working with places of worship, working with community centers to go to the government. If you're going to try to take these people and not let them stay, because what we're saying is there's probably 10 main countries that these people are from. And going, if you will not let these people stay after 12, 13 years, many of them married to Australians, children born here, would separate hundreds of these children. We're going to have a sanctuary network, and you're going to have to take them from our hands. Now, this was done historically, being around this long now, when the Timorese were here back in the 90s. And John Howard, for 10 years, left them in limbo. And I remember at the time the Jesuits, Father Peter Norton coming out going, you're going to have to rip them out of our Catholic churches. And that scared the shit out of them. Well, the same thing will happen. You have to rip out the hands of amazing people like Sister Bridget Arthur and a lot of the amazing unions here that we know will come to support an incredible rack across Australia who've been leading in this space for decades as well. I'm so grateful to the Refugee Action Collective and their incredible work. But what I'm saying to you is we might need to mobilise like this and to build these sanctuaries. And that is very much the message we're giving back to government, that if you do not give these people a process, let them be considered right now. Imagine sending people back to Iran right now, or Afghanistan, or people that haven't been in Sri Lanka for 13 years, where they're 4-year-olds now, a 70-year-old, who fled a genocide. You cannot send these people back. So we will be ready to test these cases in the High Court if the government tries exercising it. We've been trying to do more High Court actions on behalf of South Sudanese, of which there are still hundreds left in detention centres. But we will be working on a sanctuary network with, just like what happened with Baby Asha, that's the nimble grassroots, the reason we don't take federal government funding, and the ability to call the government to account. So I'm encouraging you to stay passionate and engaged. The re-election of an Albanese government means nothing has gotten better for people. It just means things weren't about to get even worse under Peter Dutton. But that can't be the threshold for victory, can it? We can't be like, oh, well, at least it's not Peter Dutton. It's like, do you mean the same government that's got 36 men still on Papua New Guinea that we speak to every week into their 13th year? Do we mean the more than 100 people trapped on Nauru? And there's also hundreds more that came from kids off Nauru that aren't even part of that 8,500. That the places have run out in New Zealand. The US isn't about to give you any more places unless you're a white South African. So what I'm encouraging you to do is to stay engaged, to stay active, to stay hopeful and passionate. We know the refugee community critically relies on people to be real allies, and that means showing up when it matters. We saw that with all the incredible support in that 100 days of protest out of Home Affairs. But I'm just saying, be ready for this. If we cannot, this government has had an entire term to resolve this for these 8,500 people, probably more like 9,000. If they don't, then it's about going back to more action on the streets. And then if they refuse to give a pathway to people in some of these countries, and it's like, well, we're going to be creating a sanctuary network for these people. You're going to have to take them before you can take them. And that's the sort of physical resistance we need to be doing. Just like we did that now with Baby Asha, going to people, are you willing to get arrested? Will you block the hospital exits apart from ambulances getting out? And people are like, yes. So if it comes to that, it needs to come to that. Because there's a time to be diplomatic and to be able to talk about these things, but that time is gone. These governments have had 13 years, and this is all deliberate. At the ACC at the moment, we've seen something like 12,000 people in the last 11 months turn up at our doorstep. 3/4 of them have no work rights, have no Medicare, are in absolute destitution. This is all deliberate. The cruelty is the point. And I think with the government now, it's going, they think they're going to get complacent. They're not even coming together going to July. When we're up there, we'll be taking a cohort of young refugees going, we've been here for 12 years. We came as children, we're now adults. If you do not move on this, we'll be taking this back to the streets and in front of every one of their officers. And if they do not give these people a pathway, well, you'll be having to take these people from us. That's what we need to be actually willing to do. Because if they won't follow the law and uphold people's constitutional rights and do what is fair and lawful and what's in their own bloody platform, then they need to understand, well, they're going to have to take on the community and see how that plays. Sometimes the only thing they understand as well is fear. We need to be not afraid to make them afraid that our community is not helpless. Just like that night where they thought a bunch of ratbag activists aren't going to be able to stop us removing this baby. They had the might of the Australian Federal Police and Home Affairs, and they lost that fight. And they've lost many fights. And I want you to think that they don't lose. They lose all the time. There are refugee advocates and refugee lawyers and activists all across this country beating this government all the time. We need to remember that and remain optimistic and hopeful and engaged and not get complacent right now, because another 3 years of Labor doesn't mean anything good for our people. Yes, that would have been even worse, but that is not progress. Getting a centrist right party that is not willing to live its own values on protecting refugees. So if you're asking what's next, it's like, look out, RAC, ASRC, and many others will be calling on you to get involved in campaigns and actions. And we've already been getting refugees to be talking about what do they want to see in the first 100 days. Everything should be led by the voices of refugees and what refugees want to see. And we'll be working closely in partnership together. So there'll be lots of opportunities. Look out, stay engaged, keep coming to events like this. It's so important to be kept up to date. But also, more than ever, refugees need good allies that aren't switching off and aren't walking away from this. It's only going to get harder. it's only going to get more complex. And there'll also be campaigns, you know, looking at trying to get more people from Gaza to be able to come here, as the government has failed to advocate for Palestinians in the way that it did for Ukrainians. There's so much work ahead for us right now. Yeah, but thank you all for coming and being part of the conversation, and for everything that you've contributed and doing as well.
No, that was absolutely amazing, Con. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, for questions. And it's because we've heard such valuable information from Con and from Ellen and from Claire in Los Angeles. I think following on from what Con said, the next thing people need to have in their calendar, it's Refugee Week coming up. I know the ASRC has lots of activities planned, but the Refugee Action Collective, we have a rally planned on Friday the 20th. It will be 5 o'clock at the State Library. We're working on organising speakers at the moment. We have Danushika Sangithan from Refugee Women Action for Visa Equality, Taki Azra, who is a Hazara musician, but also works for the United Workers Union, and there will be more. So there are plenty of leaflets at the stall at the back. So please drop by the stall, pick up leaflets, sign the petition, see what else we have to offer. There are also leaflets back there on the stall for the next Palestine rally, the next major rally, which is this Sunday. And the organisers are encouraging everybody to wear red, because if the government won't draw a red line against the genocide, then we have to draw a red line through the heart of Melbourne. So those leaflets are there at the back. There's lots of other things going on. There's the big walk for refugees. There is a former refugee who is cycling from Queensland to Adelaide, 4,000 kilometres, to raise money for the education of refugees overseas. We'll share details on our Facebook page, on our other social media pages. For those of you here in the room, Kieran has information on both of those.
And the Refugee Council website has a good list of everything happening during Refugee Week, so the late third week of June. So have a look out for that. World Refugee Day, June 20th as well. So there's lots of, even come to one thing, get involved in anything. There's lots of really joyful things that are happening during that time, and lots of great activities.
Absolutely. And we meet weekly to plan our activity. We won't be meeting next week because it's a public holiday. It's Big Ear's official birthday. So the library will be closed in honour of His Majesty Big Ears. Yeah, next Monday, no RAC meeting because of the public holiday, but we will be back here for our normal weekly meeting in a fortnight's time. I really encourage everybody to get involved. There is so much that needs to be organised, as Con outlined, and we need the input, whatever you can offer, as little or as much as you can offer. What you can offer is of vital importance.
And just one last thing I might just quickly say. One of the critical things is whether you're supporting a RAC campaign or ACC or Refugee Advocacy Council or Refugee Council, whoever it might be, I can't stress enough to you the power when you see a live campaign of picking up the phone and calling your local member of parliament or writing an email, a personalised email. The number of times we have politicians calling us going, please, for the love of God, we hear you, stop, tell them to stop calling us. Because in Parliament, it's all about the optics and around, do I have the capital to raise this in the party room? When I go 15 people from my local area ran, it takes literally 10 or 15 people asking me to make a speech about this, ask a question or raise it in a party room, they're going to do that because they're going, well, that's 15 calling. You know how rare it is for someone to call or send a personalised email? They will panic after a couple of dozen contacts. They quite seriously will. And the amount of times we've been able to garner the support, because you're a sample going, God, if that many people are calling, God knows how many other people in my community care about that. I can't stress enough how important your voice is and how effective it is and how many campaigns have been won. And on last night, sorry, David, to go over, all the things the government said were not possible that we as a movement have done. You're never going to get kids off Nauru. You're never going to evacuate 2,500 plus people from Nauru and Papua New Guinea. You're never going to get 16,000 plus extra places for Afghanistan or 12,000 extra places for Syria. You're never going to get 19,500 people on temporary visas, given a permanent protection visa. Those TPVs are here to stay. You're never going to get the refugee intake increased. You're never going to get people at a Park Hotel prison. All those are examples of victories. You're never going to pass Medivac. We never got repealed. You're never going to pass it. Well, we did. Our first defeat in 70 years. That is the power of us as a community. We are always winning for being on the right side of history. And there are so many successes out there, and there is so much hurt and suffering that is out there as well. But we draw on our successes to know that when we mobilize together on the basis of this is what is morally right, we can prevail. And just to take that away as a message from now.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Two amazing speakers. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And get ready for the next mobilisation, because it don't stop until we win. All right. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thanks, everyone.